I want to challenge you, and at the moment myself, to be optimistic based on reality. And as I understand, unfortunately, Lufthansa decided that I could spend my time yesterday evening at the airport rather than joining you. So I wasn't able to hear this presentation of this area that left everybody with the sense that the only remaining shred of optimism was the word thank you. So the challenge for all of us collectively, but very pointedly this next hour, is can we see reality exactly the way it is and act and create an optimistic future? Without either side of that equation, we're in big trouble. Can we reinvent our legacy in a way that people aren't predicting that our future can go? And if we start, which again, as I understand, there was a very good start already yesterday afternoon, but if you look at what's going on in the world, the only question you can start with is how did we get into this mess? I mean, if we're so smart, we've got years of research, we've got lots of intelligent people, we're now a networked community around the world of business people, of scholars, of government people, of leading scientists. How did we get into this mess? And when I say this mess, I refer, of course, in this group to the financial crisis, but I also refer to the environmental crisis. It's good when the lights go off right when you say environmental crisis. I refer to the moral crisis, which may in fact be the root of all of the crises. I refer to the fact that at this very moment, we have rampant poverty in the world that relegates 2/3 of the world's population to living on less than $2 a day. We have over 37 active wars going on in the world when we supposedly know something about resolving conflict without reverting to violence. We have nearly 1 billion people who entered the 21st century unable to read a book or sign their name. And for those of you who are scholars in the room, that means even if you publish an article in an A-listed journal, they will not be able to read it. We have 1.3 billion people who have no access to clean water. And every 30 seconds, a child dies of malaria, a disease that today needs to kill no one. Even just in the space of this presentation, over 100 children will die who did not need to die. Now, if I can make things even a little bit worse, I want to quote Klaus Schwab, who's of course president of the World Economic Forum. And Klaus Schwab said, in today's trust-starved climate, our market-driven system is under attack. Large parts of the population feel that business has become detached from society, that business's interests are no longer aligned with societal's interests. The only way to respond to this new wave of anti-business sentiment is for business to take the lead and to reposition itself clearly and convincingly as a part of society. You would have thought that he had said that sometime this past year, but in fact he said it in 2003. And he actually said it informally starting in the year 2000. So the condemnation was already out there that we're not playing our role in creating the type of world we want to live in, but we are a part of creating the world that we are living in. So the question he's raising is, how do we reposition ourselves? Albert Einstein, a little bit before Klaus Schwab, actually gave us some hints at what that repositioning needed to look like when he said that no problem of any significance can get solved at the level that it was created. We have to learn to see the world anew. Former UN Secretary Kofi Annan challenged the business community to reposition itself literally by jumping levels, by moving from the micro level, which, oh, by the way, is where we hold most of our conversations, and stop simply looking at the success of individual executives and managers, the success of individual companies, and the success of individual countries, and in fact begin to take the world as our client. What would it mean to reposition ourselves if the world, if civilization, was our primary client? The others, the micro level, the success of the individual person, company, country, are necessary, but they're no longer sufficient. Kofi Annan said, "Let us choose to unite the power of markets with the strengths of universal ideals. Let us choose to reconcile the creative forces of private enterprise with the needs of the disadvantaged and the requirements of future generations." Ruben Vardanian, already also at the turn of the century, raised that same question out loud before a lot of the rest of us were raising it. And what he looked out at from his position as a highly successful businessman in Russia and said that there is no way that companies can continue to succeed with society operating the way it's operating. And there's no way that either society or the economy or individual businesses can succeed with the type of leadership that we currently have. And so his input into founding one of the new business schools in the CEEMAN constellation of business schools was to ask the question, how do we create leaders that are capable of creating the kind of society that will allow for a flourishing and prosperous economy that will allow for our individual businesses and individual people to succeed? One of the main roles of education, not of business primarily, but of education, and certainly of business education, is to help people jump paradigms, to reposition themselves, to see the world anew. So my question, and again, I ask it for myself as well as for all of us collectively, and I know that none of us individually can in fact answer it, but collectively we can, is do we today, this morning, believe that we can rise to Kofi Annan's and Klaus Schwab's challenge? Do we believe that through business and through business education, we can reposition the world in a way that we would like to hand it on to our children? Let me give you both the optimistic and the pessimistic starting point. The optimistic point of view, optimistic pessimism, it's a good slip, is that over 1 billion people graduate from our management programs worldwide every year. So we have a huge potential influence, and actually we have a huge influence. Jeff Pfeffer, who's a colleague of ours at Stanford University, wonderful colleague of ours, did a meta-analysis of all the studies that looked at what's the influence of education on students. And he was looking primarily at undergraduate. I hazard to say it's the same story even if you go up to graduate level and corporate level education. At the undergraduate level, they looked at students' values at the beginning of the program when they first entered university and when they graduated from the program. And they found that most students became more worldly. They cared more about the world. They became more generous. They cared more about the world doing better. They became more compassionate. They knew more and they cared more about the rest of the world. With two exceptions, two faculties, two disciplines were the exception. Guess what those two faculties were? Don't be so silent. We all kind of know. Business is one of them. What's the other one? Law. He didn't have law. Law's safe only because law in the US, which is where Pfeffer is, isn't an undergraduate discipline. So they were off the radar screen. So if it's not law, what's the other one? Economics. Very good. I have to stand up here. Of course, my first degree was in econometrics, mathematical econ. I graduated Phi Beta Kappa in the very discipline that makes, according to the research, us more selfish, more self-interested, more greedy, less compassionate and interested in the rest of the world. So the good news is we do make a difference. The bad news is we're making the wrong kind of difference. But I think I would focus for a moment on the good news is because you know there's a whole story about any kind of major values shift is that that's supposed to happen when we're little kids at home with our parents and that we actually don't have an influence at all. Well, we do have an influence. So the choices we make today and the choices we make at each of our schools will have a huge impact on what ends up happening. So then my second companion question is, do we personally and individually in this room really believe that the quality of the world's leadership depends on the quality of the learning environments we create for our students, whether those students are CEOs or they're 20-year-olds coming into the beginning of their university experience? In Croatia, I had the privilege of talking to an executive who said out loud what most of us are thinking, but many fewer of us are actually saying, which is that we will not survive another generation with the type of leadership that dominated the 20th century. We have to figure out a way to shift it. So today, I'd like to collectively play with jumping conceptual levels. And to do that, I'd like to focus very clearly on the mess, what's going wrong out there. But I'd like to set aside for a moment the financial analysis and the political analysis and look at what's going on through the lens of leaders and artists and see what questions it raises and simultaneously what suggestions it gives us for what we teach, what we learn, and what we do. So leaders in all domains and artists who are really artists have actually three very fundamental things in common, and just three. The first is they both have the courage to see reality as it actually is, even when others are refusing to see that reality. And we've seen a lot of that this past year, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Second, they have the courage to envision possibility even when others label us as naive for being optimistic and seeing possibility in the middle of a pretty dismal reality. And third, they have the courage to inspire people, large groups of people, to move from current reality back to possibility. The courage to see reality the way it is, the courage to see possibility, and the courage to inspire people to move from reality back to possibility, leaders and artists. Let me spend a few minutes on each of those three. The first one, the courage, and I'd add for us, the skills to see reality the way it is. Are we capable of seeing the world through our own eyes? Are we capable of setting aside the media, setting aside the opinion surveys, and re-looking with our own eyes? Unfortunately, the research on human beings' ability to see reality is not very promising. If we look back, we only have to look as far as, say, Enron. You remember Enron. That was the crisis a little bit earlier than this year's crisis. Okay? Up until the time that Enron collapsed, almost all of our communities, including the management scholar communities, was praising Enron without cease. It's quite interesting. Gary Hamel, one of the big global strategists, had a book that was scheduled to come out the exact month that Enron collapsed, praising Enron. Okay? The financial markets praised Enron, the regulatory markets praised Enron, and what happened? Enron collapsed. Now you would think after having had such a big symbolic and literal collapse that we would have learned something. But as far as I mean, we're experts on learning, right? As far as I can see, the world didn't learn very much of anything, because this year we were treated to the image, the reality of Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme. $50 billion, boom, gone. Now, how is it that the world, the vast majority of the world, neither noticed what Madoff was doing, nor spoke in a way that got the attention of the rest of the world? And if you just looked at his vast range of people who invested with him, you'd say, well, you know, they were just people. But if you look at the world's financial institutions, the vast majority of the world's major financial institutions had positions with Madoff. I'm sorry, they should have noticed what was going on. They should have noticed. My favorite part of the Madoff story is the one guy who was his entire back office in his little office in London churning out reports. I'm sorry, we were capable of noticing, and yet not only did we not notice Madoff, but there's now a whole range of Ponzi schemes that are showing up in other countries, my own included, okay, that we didn't notice, including all of Wall Street. What was going on that none of us spoke until things actually went over the edge? And probably the most serious question for us, maybe we need to wait for dinner for this one, not for lunch, because we'll need a little bit of wine or something to have the courage to wade into it, is what is it that we should be seeing right now that we're not seeing? We know that the pattern is that we don't see. So what is it that we should be seeing so we don't get caught by surprise? And I'm a little bit suspicious, I've got to say, of the barrage of news the last couple weeks that we've bottomed out of this crisis and now everything is up and everything will sort itself out. Well, maybe the jobs will be a little bit slower, but on average, everything's going to be good. I am very suspicious of those stories. But actually, if I think about my favorite current blindness issues, are some of the, what I would consider very convenient reality-avoiding assumptions. My favorite is, it's too big to fail. Well, guess what? The US, the country I was born in California, is not too big to fail. No country is too big to fail. No, sorry, the planet is not too big to fail. And no, sorry, our species, human beings, is neither too big nor too important to fail. The question is, what are we going to do so that they succeed? It is not to sit back and to say, it's too big to fail, so we don't have to worry about it, business as usual. If we borrow from the psychologists, a wonderful psychologist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, years ago came up with a way of explaining how people dealt with death and dying, how individuals who got a diagnosis that they had a terminal illness, and how their friends and family dealt with death and dying. And she watched lots and lots of people who had to face that situation and found that they went through 5 stages. First, they were in denial. We seem to have heard that word already today. They absolutely denied that whatever the doctor said was true about their medical condition was true for them. They then went into a stage of anger, which usually came out at the level of, well, how could that be? I always tried to be healthy. I was a good person. This isn't fair. They were furious, which is totally understandable. Those of us, and it's already come out in the discussion this morning, who've peeked out from under denial and said, you know what, the situation's pretty serious out there, whether we look financially or morally or environmentally, and then look at what we could have done before this point, get pretty furious. And I know, having had the privilege of being born in North America, in a highly developed, economically developed country, and now living in Canada, which is a really economically and fairly socially developed country. I have the privilege of living in a very privileged place. I get furious that we are at the stage we are in terms of the environment, in terms of world income distribution, in terms of a whole series of issues. The third stage that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified was bargaining. And at the level of individuals, that's where you see the, well, I'll just eat really healthy food, and I'll just stop smoking if you just let me live. And people who are religious start saying, well, I'll go to church on a regular basis, or I'll go to the synagogue, or I'll go to the mosque, or I'll pray regularly. Please let me live. Now, we'd like to relegate that off to the individual faced with death. It's understandable. But think for a moment, and I'll take an environmental example. Think about our discussion around the Kyoto Accords. Most of the discussion around the Kyoto Accords has been to beat up on the countries that haven't signed, to praise the countries that have signed, and not notice that neither group has actually been living up to the Kyoto Accords. What nobody is busy saying in that's a bargaining. Oh, if we just have enough countries sign up for the Kyoto Accords, then the Earth will be okay. Well, guess what? There's a phrase that I love from William McDonough, who's an architect, which is a form of artist, called less bad is not good. So reducing a little bit the amount of pollution. What's the Kyoto Accords all about? We will reduce pollution in X category by Y amount by X year. Okay? It has nothing to do with good. It has nothing to do with creating a healthy environment. It only has to do with less bad. Well, less bad when you're approaching death means that maybe you get there a day or two later. It does not mean that you're healthy. Bargaining. Watch out for our vocabulary. When we do surface with solutions, we're overwhelmed by bargaining solutions in the category of less bad. Now, you can guess, you're probably feeling it at the moment, what stage 4 is. That's called depression. When you sit there and go, oh no, it's true. Yes, I'm angry that it's true, but that doesn't change anything. It's just, it's true. This is the situation we're actually in. None of these bargaining things are going to work. Less bad is not going to work. And it's this overwhelming sense of, it's hopeless. There's nothing I can do. That's what depression is all about. And it may be that we have to touch depression and refuse to stay there before we can move on. It often happens at the individual level. We don't know that at the macro level. We've never had the interrelated world that we have right now, where all of us are literally in it together. We used to be able to bargain and think, well, your country might have gone down in its economy by that much, but it's not going to affect me. Your air pollution may be awful, but I live in a country that it's not going to be awful. I was born in Los Angeles. Los Angeles had an awful pollution problem because it's in a basin surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, and they didn't believe in public transportation, so everybody had a car, and then the warm air comes in off the ocean and traps all the polluted air, so it just kind of hangs over Los Angeles. But Los Angeles got scared because it got so bad and had such huge health consequences, so they did a huge amount of stuff to clean up the air, which was great, and it got better. And then a few years ago, about the turn of the century, it started getting dramatically worse again. Now, what's going on? Did LA forget about its commitment? No, it kept its commitment. 85% of the air pollution that is now in Los Angeles is generated in China and comes over on the trade winds. So do we get angry at China? No. The answer is we realize that we're one world, and either all of us make it or none of us make it. The last stage of Kubler-Ross for the individual was acceptance. You accept that, in fact, the diagnosis is true and that you have very little time left to live. For us as a community, as a global community, as a management leadership learning community, I don't go to acceptance that this is the mess, you know, time's over, take off the microphone, live with it. What I say we have to accept is not the situation, but we have to accept our responsibility in a very different way than we've ever looked at it before. And there's a nasty little secret in case you have any illusion that there's a brighter, smarter, more committed group of people meeting someplace else in the world. There isn't. Either we come up with it, there's a network of we, but either we come up with that solution or it doesn't happen. We can't wait to let and hope that somebody else will do it. So if we start with that first question of do we have the courage to see reality the way it is, there's actually been a quite interesting experiment going on ability to see. And it didn't, unfortunately, it'd be much more fun if it did, come out of our profession. It actually came out of the medical profession. And Yale University Medical School, which happens to have a very, very good medical school, came up with an experiment about 10 years ago where they partnered with the art history department at Yale, and they decided to take their first-year medical students, and they gave all of them the normal training in terms of becoming good diagnosticians, being able to tell what disease people had or didn't have, and they gave a subgroup a course in art history. Now, this wasn't a course where they actually drew or painted. It was just a course where they looked at paintings and learned something about it. It happened to be British end of 1700s, beginning of 1800s paintings. Very traditional, not contemporary art, okay? At the end of one semester, they started to look at the two groups, ability to diagnose. And they were shocked to discover that the people who had had an art history course, the medical students who'd had an art history course, were significantly better diagnosticians than the people who hadn't had an art history course. Just as a quick thing, why would you guess that that's true? Because one is that you look at the whole picture rather than just homing in on, you know, the cardiologist only looks at your heart and the ophthalmologist only looks at your eyes. So they were trained to look at the whole thing. Why else?
Ability to create visions, a picture.
Ability, they didn't say to create a picture, but to see patterns in different ways, not to see the patterns of your... Yeah, putting together images that wouldn't necessarily...
Images in the reality of the art.
Perfect. Why else? History, meaning? Looking at where did that come from, so therefore where might it fit and where might it not fit? What else? You're missing a big one. Art, because they just liked art. Well, that's of course true, but I can't say it up here. Later in the talk. One other.
Understanding of other person.
Understanding of other person, somewhat, but you're giving the art history course a little bit more credit than it's, but I'll take it. I like it. I agree with it. Why not?
The meaning of the education of the art.
Of the reality.
Whether yes, and to create this level of aha, yes, I understand. I can put the diagnosis.
Absolutely. Right behind. You guys are actually giving them more credit and getting more. It's all true, but the big difference where they were able to see the details. They were able to see reality. That when they compared them with the non-art, I hesitate to say art-trained, one art history course, okay, is the students that took the art history course actually saw more of the details in their patients. Then they jumped into seeing the patterns and what that might mean and how it fit with the history. But their big difference is they saw more information. They saw more details, so they had better information to make a pattern. And even better, which goes to the history, goes to the sense making, is that they weren't as sure of their diagnosis as were their colleagues, so that the art-trained medical student would say, I think it might be best diagnosis. But then they would watch really carefully if the person responded in an appropriate way to whatever the treatment regime was, then that diagnosis was probably right. If they didn't, they much more quickly said, well, let's look at this again, maybe it's wrong. Whereas the non-art trained people saw fewer details, concluded much more quickly. As soon as they saw a pattern, they said it's the pattern, that's what the person has, and closed off the possibility of seeing more.
And I guess also they can put logic, rational and emotional things together because it goes together in arts.
Right, that they could integrate. There's a much wider range of what data actually is. It's not just the physical things that are normally called symptoms. What's happened with that program? Yale was so flabbergasted at the results that they sat down as their education committee and now have all of their students, all of their medical students, get art history. It's now 10 years later, and 20 of the leading medical schools in the US now have art history components in it. Not because they're trying to fill up the museums and get a whole group of art lovers, although it's helping on that too, but because they want their students to have the kind of diagnostic skills. My question is, what do we need to do in order to reclaim the diagnostic abilities, the ability to see, for our managers, our executives, our leaders, our management professors? And we wouldn't even be asking that question if we didn't believe that we could make a difference. Why bother if we don't believe we can make a difference? Why change our curriculum if we don't believe we can make a difference? And when I keep on saying make a difference, that doesn't come out of hubris, it doesn't come out of pride, but in fact comes out of our responsibility and the humility that comes with responsibility. Now, to ask a slightly dicey question, and then I'll go on to the second dimension, do we have the courage to see what's going on in our own management schools? And if I just raise one question, do we have the courage to see how we currently recruit, motivate, reward, and promote our faculty members? And do we really think that counting the number of publications in A-listed journals and counting the number of citations in a limited number of sources is what is leading to our best faculty asking questions that matter? What are we doing in our management schools to recruit, support, and promote people to ask the really big, messy questions and get them communicated out in the world so that other people will start a conversation about them? Those of us, well, most of the world, but those of us especially who were in North America, were riveted last month by the passing of Senator Ted Kennedy, and in part because he had had a huge influence on the legislative agenda and the conversation about the social world and how a social system could work, might work, and what needed to happen. And one of the big issues that Ted Kennedy had worked for years on was health care, and of course there's a huge health care debate going on in the US right now. Ted Kennedy, after he'd gotten diagnosed with a brain tumor, after he'd had the surgery to try and correct it, which didn't end up succeeding, after he had completely knocked out his immune system because of that surgery, he still called the head of the Senate and said, if there's a critical vote on health care, I will be there. If it's not critical, please don't call me, because I'm not supposed to be around anybody because I don't have an immune system anymore and it could kill me. The head of the Senate did call Ted Kennedy and he did show up. So I ask you, how many of us are conducting research, writing articles where we would literally put our life on the line in order to continue to advance what we're doing? And if we're not, then what are the issues that we believe in so much that we would put our life on the line for them? And as we teach our students, again, whether that student is 20 years old or we're sitting with a group of senior CEOs, what are we doing to teach the ability to see? What are we doing to teach the courage it takes to see the realities that each of us face? I want to more quickly put in the other two dimensions. So if the first dimension is the courage to see reality the way it is, the second, that artists and leaders have in common. The second is, do we have the skills and the courage to see possibility? Deepak Chopra, who's from India and is a quite famous medical doctor, quite famous for shifting the paradigm in medicine, says, fight the prognosis, not the diagnosis. The diagnosis has to do with the first dimension, our courage to see reality the way it is. The prognosis has to do with the second dimension. Do we have the courage to see possibility even when nobody else sees it? Again, our research tradition helps us a little bit with this. We all know from way back there, actually originally talked about in the 50s, published in the 60s, is Thomas Kuhn when he published his book, The Nature of Scientific Revolutions. Close to that, The Nature of Scientific Revolution. The structure of scientific. I knew I was close, but okay. The structure of scientific revolutions confirmed that even if we have data to show that the current paradigm or the current system isn't working, we don't jump to a new paradigm until that paradigm has been put out there. So we don't get rid of the way we're seeing the world just because all the data, like our financial analysis that's coming in that doesn't predict very well, or our economic analysis that's coming in that doesn't predict very well, we don't get rid of the current system until somebody comes up with something that looks like a better alternative, and then we actually shift quite quickly. Richard Bolin and Fred Colopy, who are both at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, have begun to shift the thinking in management schools from a decision-making paradigm over to a design paradigm. Design, of course, is an artistic discipline. Our current management schools, almost all of them, are extraordinarily good at teaching us different ways of making very sophisticated decisions. But basically, very sophisticated decisions say, if you've got this alternative, the blue cap, this alternative, the red cap, and the empty glass, what's the best one to choose? Do I go to China? Do I expand to China? Don't I expand to China? Do I expand my operations in Brazil and India? Don't I expand it? Here are the options, Brazil, China, India, whatever, and I learn very sophisticated ways of choosing between them. That's a decision-making question. The design question is, am I capable of creating an option worthy of choosing? It always goes beyond what's on the table. I would say that it's the time for us to look at design and how we learn design, how we teach design, how we immerse ourselves in design. Just last week, I came from Finland, where I was at a conference that was called the Creative Economy and Beyond, that brought together the political leaders, the business leaders, and the design community inside of the Finland's Design Week in order to ask that question. And they actually took questions such as what's going on with the economy and environment, they labeled them hot potatoes, and then they gave them to top design teams to see what they could come up with for alternatives that have never been on the table but might be worth choosing. It's not surprising that there are beginning to be programs, business programs, now popping up around the world that are merging design and business. I was quite interested to see that there's now an art school that's put an MBA program into an art school. So there's a whole interesting conversation going on right now about how can we use our innovative design capability to create options for the society, which of course is exactly what Klaus Schwab and Kofi Annan were hoping we would do. Some of the options in that category, I want to give you just a couple that have caught my attention. One is there's a venture capitalist happens to be based out of Boston, Bobby Sager, who did what a lot of venture capitalists do. He made a bunch of money. He then did what a lot of other venture capitalists do. He created a foundation and started to give some money away. You know, nice. He then very quickly realized that his real skill wasn't just in making money and giving it away, but was in recognizing businesses that could be successful and helping them be even more successful. So what does he do? He goes over to Rwanda. This was post-94, so after the genocide. And he began to set up a project that is basically a micro-enterprise project, a la Yunus, the type of projects that Yunus got his Nobel Peace Prize for. The first time ever that a business economics model got the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay? But he did something, and it was primarily to women and the rest of the stuff that goes on with micro-enterprise projects. But he did something completely different. He made one of the requirements in Rwanda that in order to fund a business, one of the women had to be a Hutu, that's the dominant population, 85% of the people in Rwanda are Hutu, whose brother, father, son, uncle had been condemned of killing a Tutsi. And it had to include a Tutsi whose brother, husband, son, father had been killed. So he was weaving together the social fabric through an economic model that would weave together the country. Those of you who haven't been following Rwanda really closely, it actually has been growing at 11% a year. The economy is doing quite well. There's a whole set of innovative projects. But that's the kind of process that I would put into the design category. Bobby Sager didn't say, oh, let me see what everybody else is doing. I'm just going to replicate it in Rwanda. He invented something that had never been there before. We've been looking at a lot of the solutions that we need in the world, which tend to be multi-sector solutions. And just last fall, I was working with the a worldwide conference on global health diplomacy that had the WHO, the World Health Organization. It was sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It had all the major companies that are involved in food and agriculture and the scientific community. And it was the first time that that multi-sector group had got together to address food safety, food security, and what they call right nutrition. So not poverty-related malnutrition and not obesity. So all the biggie nutrition issues in the world. Okay? As they began to move into getting multi-sector, getting the agricultural community and food community and science community and government community, everybody together, C.K. Prahalad, who was working with us, pointed out to them that in all multi-sector collaborations, big ones that we've looked at, the biggest problem isn't that it doesn't make sense, because it does make sense for everybody to work together, but that everybody sees the other sector as the enemy. And you could see it in our room. You could see, here's the World Health Organization director, here's the head of McDonald's. There was no way they wanted the press anywhere close to them, because the World Health Organization would lose all credibility if they were ever seen talking to McDonald's. So how do you get the conversation going? Well, the way we tried to get the conversation going, we used lots of techniques to get it going, but we took the whole group of them over to our Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montreal, our contemporary art museum, which delightfully had an exhibition on called Sympathy for the Devil. And in the case of the art, it was between rock musicians and pop artists who never wanted to work with each other. But we put everybody in that environment to jump the conversation so they could start talking across those boundaries and admit that the very feelings they had about the other sector was part of what was getting in the way of them moving ahead. I don't think it's surprising that a lot of the art conversation, the leading art and management conversations, are coming out of this part of the world. because it's out of this part of the world that you can see a lot of what's going right and what is very much not going right in the world. When I look at what Danitsa's doing in Bled, there's no other school in the world that I know of that's got 8 full days in their management curriculum on the arts. I don't think it's a surprise that when Peter Drucker first met your school, that he said it was the best management school in the world. The only reason he can't repeat that is because he's no longer alive, but otherwise he would. I think it's no surprise that Warren Buffett, who's had the courage to go up against the trends in the financial market, has said on multiple occasions, I am an artist, I am not a businessman. So that brings us to the third question and brings us to bringing this all together. So if the first is the courage to see reality the way it is, the second is the courage to see possibility, the third is the courage to inspire people to move from reality back to possibility. Do we have the audacity to be hopeful and the courage to express our hope within our own professional domain? Do we have the audacity to be hopeful beyond thank you when we're standing in Latvia today? If you look at the world's reaction to the shift from President Bush, who used a lot of fear in his style of leadership, to the current president, Barack Obama, in using hope, you can see quite graphically what happens when inspiration re-enters the conversation. If I watch what happens in my own profession, though, I get a little bit depressed. If you look at, I'm going narrow for a second. I have my degree in organization behavior, international organization behavior. Organization behavior has spewed out mountains of articles, research studies on motivation. It almost has no studies on inspiration. The underlying paradigm of motivation is, how can I get you to do something I want you to do, but you may not want to do? What do we know about getting people collectively together to do when they actually firmly believe in what it is that they're doing? One of the most interesting studies to me, surveys actually, was in Silicon Valley at the height of the dot-com boom before that one went bust. And the big issue was, how do you attract and retain the top talent? And of course, Silicon Valley first competed on salaries. Up, 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 we'll motivate them with money, right? Well, the only thing is that was eminently copyable, so people continued to just outbid each other. The only thing it did was send salaries up. They then competed on compensation packages. That was copyable, they just bid it up. They then began to actually look at which were the Silicon Valley firms that were able to attract, but even more important, retain their top talent. And the answer was, dramatically the answer was, the companies where people felt that what they were doing was meaningful. So it may be, in today's vernacular, the people who were working on the $100 laptop because they really believed they were doing something that was worthwhile in the world. They were bringing better education system, better health systems. It didn't make any difference what it was, and it was different for different people. But the people were there and stayed there if they personally believed that what they were doing was meaningful. If they felt they could go home to their kids and their grandkids and tell them about what they did at work today. So then I have to ask the question of our financial crisis. If you think about Wall Street for a moment, you can think about London or Tokyo or other parts of the world, but I'll focus on Wall Street for a moment. And you ask the question of what motivates those Wall Street people and what inspires those Wall Street people. And you think about Peter Drucker's statement that you're not really a leader unless people would be willing to volunteer to work for you. Peter Drucker wasn't against paying people, but he believed you weren't a leader unless people were willing to volunteer to work for you. So how many of these Wall Street folks do you think would show up if the compensation scheme wasn't based on very creative levels of greed, but said that you show up and you don't get paid? Not today, not this week, not this month, not this decade. And if we ask that question, what are we teaching in our management schools so that we could help the people we send out in the world create systems that were based on inspiration for attracting and retaining people rather than based on greed? And again, I want to give you an image. There's a huge conversation going on in many countries right now about the education system in general, not just the education system for business. And one of the foci is on kindergarten, beginning school, up through high school graduation. So in the US, that's a big conversation right now. And there are two very interesting voices, actually in North America. One's Canadian, one's American. At Harvard, in their economics department, Roland Fryer has come up with a solution to the education problem. The US scores on all competitive tests have been going down, 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 down. He said, what we need to do is we need to pay students for getting A's. And then they will work harder and they will get A's. And I'm sitting there horrified, and we will teach every student that learning has no intrinsic value. The only value is getting this little bit of money because I got an A. Alternative model. Nora Savage, who happens to be in Toronto in Canada, has a program where she takes 12th graders, students who are in their last year of high school, who, you know what kids are like in their last year of high school. They're ready to graduate. They don't need you anymore. They don't need to listen anymore. They're better than it all. Who wants it? Well, she takes high school students and she pairs each high school student, this is needless to say with the help of the province, with a stage 1 Alzheimer's patient. Stage 1 means they're still able to be at home, but they're losing their memory already. And the job of that 12th grader, that puffed up 12th grader, is to go interview them and to get their stories, starting with their way back stories, because that's where memory is better, but if you start way back, actually the memory becomes better as it comes up. And then to put those stories together in a book and have an assembly where the person and their family get to invite all of the extended family and their friends, and the student presents who this person really is. Well, overwhelmingly, the statement from the students is that this is the best and most important learning experience I've ever had. They go from, I don't want to go on the first interview, to 10 weeks later, when they've been going twice a week for all those 10 weeks, to not wanting to leave their elder, and most of them continue seeing the elder. They badger their English teachers to teach them more about narrative, how you write a good story, about grammar, about how you tell a good story, about how you weave it together in a book, about who has written other good books about stories so that they can learn from it. They learn more in that one semester about writing and English and communication and listening and interviewing and being a responsible person. Because the real gift of that program to the students is that the program says, we trust you with a person's life. Now, simultaneously, guess what? The families love it because the students give the person back to the family instead of the person being a diagnosis, a disease. And the medical community is actually kind of mystified by it at the moment because you see huge gains in the elders, the Alzheimer's patients' ability to talk, listen, and remember. And there's now cognitive research to show that their skills actually go up. And it takes no medical intervention whatsoever. No doctors, no nurses, no medications, in addition to anything else that they were doing. If you were going to choose Roland Fryer, our Harvard economist, and start doling out money for grades, or Nora Savage, which system would you try? And which system are we teaching in our business schools, and can't we do better than we're doing? How many people really feel that if we treat our professors in a way that says, I'm counting the number of citations that you got on your last article, that they will turn around and teach our world leaders Nora's message rather than Roland Fryer's. So let me bring this to a conclusion. At McGill, at the university where I'm at when I'm not in Latvia, I teach a course called Global Leadership, Redefining Success. And in a slightly subversive fashion, I've gotten the course as the first week that the MBAs are ever in the program. So before they meet any of my colleagues, they meet me and I get them for a whole week, 9 to 5, right? So I get to set the culture. And we have a lot of conversations about why are you giving up these 2 years to be in our program? And our program, by the way, we have about 100 people coming in each year, and they're from 53 this past year, we have 53 different countries represented. So it's very global. By the end of that week, the single most frequent comment is, but I didn't know that other people in an MBA program would care about the things that I care about. And for some of them, that's work-life balance. For some of them, it's the environment. For some of them, it's all different things. But it's all the big issues that you would want them to care about. So what's the signaling we're doing in our MBA programs that makes all of these wonderful young people who have all these broad interests, concerns, passions, and compassions think that the minute they walk in our door, they have to reduce themselves to a balance sheet and only talk about making more money. Our role as leaders, our personal role as leaders in management education, is to make a difference in the world. None of you would have shown up at this meeting unless you believed that. And I believe that only by investing in the artistry of our humanity will we be able to create the peaceful, prosperous planet that not only we deserve, but our children and our children's children deserve. Thank you.